All right, if you'll join me by opening your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 11. Let me begin by drinking a glass of water. Say, Pastor, you just drank a glass of water. How do you know that wasn't poisoned? How do I know that wasn't poisoned? Anybody? Yeah, I think Ray Underhill has been collecting the water downstairs. Is that still true, Ray? See, he's been doing this for a long time. No one's died yet. So I'm just taking it by faith and Ray, that this is not poison. We have been talking about living by faith, and the truth is we live by faith every day. Every day we live by faith. As you are driving along and you approach a traffic signal and it's green, you just buzz right through, don't you? You don't stop and make sure it's red in the other direction. You just take it by faith it's red. You can't see it, but you believe it. You believe it without seeing it. If you're board an airplane, as you're getting on the plane there and you see a guy in a captain's uniform, do you quiz him about, is he really a captain? Did he really, take the test and go through all, you take it by faith and you let him fly you 30,000 feet off the ground. That's by faith. We live by faith all the time. And God tells us if we're going to have a relationship with Him, if we're going to live in this world and please Him and live successfully, we have to live by faith, seeing the things that are unseen in His world. In other words, if we are going to live our lives having to see everything, we're never going to please God, and we're not going to live successfully in this world. God says you're going to live with me and in this world, and a large part of it you're not going to see. And you're just going to have to trust me by faith. Today we are going to look at how to live by faith. How to live by faith. We start off the Christian life becoming born again by one act of saving faith. And you trust and you're born again and you are saved. But that's not the finish line. That's the starting line of a whole life lived now by faith. Every day living by faith. Paul says it in Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ and I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God. Are you living by faith today? If you're a Christian, you put your faith in Christ, and that caused you to be reborn. But now, are you living every day by faith? You'd say, well, Pastor, I think so. How would I know? The answer to that is found in looking at the person of faith in the Bible. There are thousands of people of faith in the Bible. There is only one person who's lifted up as the father of faith. Who is it? Abraham. 3 times it says he's the father of faith. And by looking at Abraham's life, we can learn and understand what living by faith is like. So this morning we're going to look at Abraham's life and see 4 marks of daily faith in this man's life. And the questions we want to do is ask ourselves, are those marks in our lives? Are you a person who's living daily by faith? That's God's desire for you. You cannot please God without faith. And so if you want to please God, you need to live daily in faith. We want to look to see if these 4 marks are in your life. Okay? So let's look, starting at verse 8, 4 marks of the person who lives by faith. Hebrews 11, verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. Okay. One day God came to Abraham and he says, I'm going to give you a promise and a command. And he promised Abraham, this is out of the blue, God appears to him. He lived in an idol-worshiping town. His family were idol worshippers. We don't know the circumstances, but God comes to Abraham and he says, I'm making you a promise. I'm going to give you a land of your own and make you great. Now imagine if God came to you and he said, I'm going to give you some land. That's what he did when he came to Abraham. And then he gives him a command. The command is, I want you to get up and follow me. Pack up your whole family, follow me to this land. And I'm not going to tell you exactly where it is until you get there. You'll have to go by faith. Here's a promise, here's a command, and if you want it, you got to go out by faith. Leave your job, leave your relatives, leave your hometown, and go and just stop when I tell you to stop? Would you be able to do that today? God appeared to you and said, pack up everything and just head out, and I'll tell you when to stop. Would you do that? Can you imagine talking to his wife? Honey, what are we doing? Oh, God appeared to me. We're leaving, packing everything. I don't know where we're going. That's what was going on with Abraham. If he had chosen sight, would Abraham have gone? Absolutely not. There's 100 reasons not to go. But you choose faith, you look beyond those reasons that you see, and you look to God, who you can't see, and that's what Abraham chose. Abraham chose to go by faith. Now, we don't know what God did to convince him that it was trustworthy. God did something to make this man say, you know what, this is worth it, I'm going. But somehow God communicated that I am trustworthy to him. And then Abraham threw off all his doubts, threw off all his discomfort at doing this, and left, following God. And that gives us the first mark of living by faith. Here it is. Willingness to follow God out of your comfort zone. Willingness to follow God out of your comfort zone. One of the biggest obstacles of living by faith is fear. Fear. Someone asks you to teach a Sunday school class. Someone at work says, I want to give you a really big job responsibility. Someone says there's a really good ministry that needs some serious money put into it. Would you give? Opportunities come up, and very oftentimes fear grips us. Whoa, I could never teach a Sunday school class. That is now in no. And I can't give, and I can't take on that responsibility. And all the what-ifs come up of, what if this happens, this happens, this happens. No, I can't do that. Fear is a huge obstacle that stands in the way. Now, wisdom says, consider, opportunities as they come to you. But here's the truth. How often does God throw us softballs when asking us to do things for him? Very few times does God throw us softballs. Was Moses in his comfort zone when God says, I want you to go down to Egypt and set my people free? Moses said, I don't speak well, I don't know what to say, they won't listen to me. And God says, go, I'm going to be with you. That was way out of his comfort zone. How about Gideon? When God says, I want you to take 300 men and I want you to go against the 125,000 Midianites. And Gideon says, my family is the weakest of all the tribes, and I am the least important person in my family. There's no way I can do that. And God says, go, I'm going to be with you. And when God came to the prophet Jeremiah, he says, I'm choosing you to go speak to my people, be the prophet for the nation. And Jeremiah says, Lord God, I do not know how to speak. I'm too young. And God says, go, I'm going to be with you. And for you and me too, if we are going to walk by faith and live pleasing God, we are going to have to move out of our comfort zones a lot of the time. God regularly pulls us out of our comfort zones to walk with him. But if you are committed to running from discomfort, you're never going to please God. You're never going to live in the power of God. God says you can be in the very center of my will and feel uneasy and uncomfortable and unprepared. And that's exactly where I want you. That is something to run from. That is what I have right now. And in your case, it's a qualification because I want you to feel needy independent so that you rely upon me. Does this mean you have to say yes to everything that makes you uncomfortable when it comes along? No. No, what you do is you go before God and you say, here's an opportunity that has been put before me. I need your wisdom. And God promises wisdom to those who ask. You pray, you seek the scriptures for any guidance, you ask for godly counsel, ask for signs if you need to, like Gideon did. But you ask and you ask and you ask, and you don't make a decision about that opportunity until God gives you a sense that this is what you're supposed to do. And then once you get that sense, whether it is to turn it down or to take it up, then you move forward with that. And if you turn it down, You don't apologize for, I'm really sorry, No, you say, no, God is not leading me into this. There are far too many people in this world who will pressure you into doing what they want you to do. And if you're one of those people that has a hard time saying no, you have to learn how to understand that you're not going to answer to them on Judgment Day. You're going to answer to Jesus on Judgment Day. So you need to go to prayer, search His Word, ask for godly counsel until the point that you know that you're going to stand before Him one day and look Him eye to eye about this very issue and say, I did what you wanted me to do. I turned that down because I didn't feel that you were leading me to do it. And I did sense that you were leading me to do this. So just because you feel uncomfortable doesn't mean you have to do it. But on the other hand, just because you do feel uncomfortable doesn't mean, hey, that's not God's will for you. God's will, very often in the Bible, made people feel very uncomfortable. And it's exactly what God wanted them to do. Just about every year before I go to Kenya, people will come up to me and say, hey, did you hear about the crisis going on in Kenya? And there's always a crisis going on. There's a crisis going on right now. There's 3 days of people who are in the streets of Kenya, and people have died. And I used to get all wound up about this, but after 13 years, I've learned my job is to seek God until I get a green light or a red light. It isn't to say, is there something going on? Because I'm not going if there's something going on. If I did that, I'd never go. So every year I ask God, and I pray and I pray and I pray until I am convinced I've got a green light to go. And then no matter what the crisis is, remember the one year the airport burned down, that was a green light year, and I went and we dealt with it, and it was exciting, wasn't it, Gabby? Last year I got a red light. There was opportunity to go, and I prayed, and I just could not get the sense that I was supposed to go, and so I didn't go last year. But whether it's comfortable or uncomfortable really isn't the issue. It's what is God leading us to do? And God regularly leads us into doing things that are uncomfortable. So here's the truth here. Never say no to something just because it makes you feel uncomfortable. Never. First of all, go to God. Seek His will. Pray and seek counsel, seek His Word, and you make the decision based on what you sense He's doing. And if it's a yes, it might very well make you feel uncomfortable, but go anyway. Huge numbers of faithful Christians did that. So do you feel God leading you to an opportunity to do something, say something, go somewhere? Fear says, I'm not going to go there if it makes me feel uncomfortable. Faith says, I will seek God about it, even though it makes me feel uncomfortable. Are you living that way? That's one of the marks of living by faith. The second mark of living by faith is found in verses 9 through 10. Look at verse 9. By faith, Abraham lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. So once Abraham got into Canaan, God took him out onto a hill, and He said, I want you to look, and everything that your eye sees, I'm going to give to you. Wow. Now, you imagine, he has lived in this town, and he comes out of it with just what he can carry away. He has nothing. And now God suddenly says, see all this? This is yours. His land. His land. He doesn't have to pay taxes to anybody. It's His land. His land. He could be the king of this land, live in a palace. It's His. God just grants it to him, and now it's his land. But wait a minute. When did Abraham get that land? It was promised to him that day, but when did he actually take possession of that land? We find him living in tents for the rest of his time in the book of Genesis, wandering around. During his time, he never got possession of the land. And his son, Isaac, lived in tents, wandering around, never got possession of the land. His son, Jacob, wandered around, living in tents. His son, Joseph, you know what happened to him. He got taken down to Egypt as a slave, then became Pharaoh's right-hand man. He didn't possess the land. 400 years in Egypt, no one possessed the land. They get out of Egypt, 40 years in the desert, no one's possessing land. Finally, Joshua and his generation goes in, and they get possession of the land. Over here, Abraham's promised it 600 years earlier. How long? It took 600 years for that land to actually become their land. Promised way over here, but it became way over there. That gives us the second mark. Well, actually, look at verse 13. All these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and having welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. The second mark of living by faith, here it is, learning to wait for God to work. Learning to wait for God to work. That's a mark of living by faith. Jesus said, "Ask and you shall receive." But he never said when, right? He says, ask, and if it's in my will, you're going to receive. And maybe you completely understand that because you've been praying and praying and praying, and whether for a health condition or for a person or for a personal problem going on in your life, and you see no results. But Jesus is asking, you're going to receive. Yes, but oftentimes the timing of God is way later than our time. Missionaries labor for years on the mission field and see very, very little results. Laboring. It seems like, but nothing's going on. Your life, you could labor. You can pray and pray and pray. You can pour yourself into all these different things and see very, very little results because it's not God's timing yet. And if you're going to live by faith, you're going to have to accept God's timing is often not what I expect. What do you do when you find out that your timing is not God's timing, that you've just got to wait? You do what Abraham did. Look at verse 10. This is what Abraham did. It says, "For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God." And then look at verse 16. "But as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them." Abraham could have thrown his hands in the air and he said, "You promised me. Look," and I looked and I saw that land. You said it would be mine, and I've never gotten it. I've been here all these years. I've never gotten it. And he could have just walked away from God. And you can do the same thing with your prayers. You can say, "I prayed and I prayed and prayed for this personal problem to go away, and you're not doing anything about it. I throw up my hands. I'm done. I quit." Bishop Moses has told me that because of the poverty and the drought going on in Kenya for so long, there are many, many, many people leaving the Christian churches, going back to their tribal religions, because they're not seeing any results, and they're giving up. God says, if you're going to live by faith, you're going to have to get used to waiting. It's not that I'm not keeping my promise. It's just that there's a lot of waiting that goes on, because my timing and your timing oftentimes doesn't match up. What can you do if you need to hang in there and wait for something that you're struggling with? Do what Abraham did. Abraham looked off to the city that is coming. He says, "I'm not getting the land here, but I know about a city that God has built. He's the architect and the builders, and I'm keeping my eye on that city, and I'm longing for that." That's what we read about in Revelation. And it's the same thing that we are told to do. That's why he tells us about the New Jerusalem descending out of heaven like a bride, golden walls and city and the streets. He tells us that so that our focus will be on there. If we focus upon the stuff on this earth that we're not getting and all the things that are going wrong, we're going to be pulled down and give up and maybe leave our religion. Jesus says, you keep your eye on that city that's coming, because one day you're going to enter that city, and all your hard work is going to be rewarded. All your prayers will have been answered. Everything that you put your life into will have its reward there. So as you are in this time period right now, whatever you're waiting for right now, don't give up. Faith doesn't give up. Sight will give up because I'm not seeing results. But faith doesn't give up. Faith keeps going when you don't see results, because your eyes are on the future where those results are promised, absolutely promised there. Do you need to do that this morning for something that you're struggling with? Hang in there. Live a life by faith, not by sight. The third mark of living by faith is found in verses 11 and 12. Look at verse 11. By faith, even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead as that, as many descendants as the stars of heaven in number, and as innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. So here Sarah herself is honored for her great faith, woman of faith. But, she didn't start off that way. Do you remember what happened when God came to her and said, you're going to have a child? Yeah, she laughed. Why'd she laugh? Number one, she was way too old. Old women don't have children. Number two, if she had been young, she'd been barren all her life. She'd never had a child. So sight says you put together a barren woman who is way too old, this isn't going to happen. But faith said, God controls conception. Not age, not some biological problem. God controls conception. And she says, I'm going to believe anyway. I know it's impossible, but I'm going to believe anyway. And that belief triggered God's impossible smashing power and smashed that impossible situation. And she was able to conceive. And they had children like the sand of the seashore eventually, their descendants. Third mark of living by faith. Here it is. Believing the impossible is possible. Believing the impossible is possible. We know in our heads that God can do the impossible, right? If I took a quiz, you'd say, yeah, that is one of the things he can do. And he can overcome anything, and it's bigger than any problem we can face. We know that, but how often do we not trust that? Faith really believes that. Look at verses 32 to 34. It says, and what more shall I say? For time will fail me if I tell of Gideon and Barak and Samson and Jephthah, of David and Samuel and the prophets, who by faith conquered kingdoms, performed acts of righteousness, obtained promises, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, from weakness were made strong, became mighty in war, putting foreign armies to flight. Women received back their dead by resurrection, and others were tortured, not accepting their release, so that they might obtain a better resurrection. How many of those things listed there were impossible? Just about every single one of them was impossible. Again, Gideon would be told by God, I want you to go and take 300 men and save Israel from the 125,000 Midianites. That's impossible. I'm sorry, that's not something that we could say, well, what are the odds? There are no odds. You don't take 300 people and get rid of 125,000. Samson should never have been able to kill 1,000 people with a bone. He did. That's an impossible situation. That doesn't happen. Jesus was going along and he met a man's funeral. They're carrying him out in his coffin to his gravesite, and he walks over and raises the man from the dead. That shouldn't have happened. Those are all impossible situations. How come they happen? Because God is a God of impossible smashing power. That's what he is. I remember once I was really discouraged about a family member. I'd been praying and praying and praying for them to change, and then something terrible happened to them, and I just said, God, I give up. I'm going to stop praying for them. They just aren't headed in the right direction. There's nothing that can happen. And then I remembered this. Hold on. I believe in an impossible smashing God. Of course I can't give up. And started praying diligently again. If you are going to live by faith, you cannot put God within limits. You cannot put him in a box and say this is the way he can do and he doesn't do this. God regularly does things that are impossible to happen. Now that doesn't mean he does everything that's impossible. God will decide whether or not he will do that impossible act. Your part is to believe he can and make the requests and do whatever you need to do to urge him to do that. He will decide whether it's a good thing that I want done, but you are supposed to deal with him as if there's nothing out of bounds here. Everything can happen. That's the way God wants us to deal with them. Look at this verse. I love this verse. Ephesians 3:20. It says, "Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly beyond all that we ask or think, according to the power that works within us." Look at this carefully. It says God is able to do what we ask. Do you believe God is able to do what you ask? Yeah, I believe that. It says God is able to do all that we ask. All. You can ask a lot of things. God's able to do all that you ask. Not just all that you ask, he's able to do beyond all that you ask. Wait a minute. He's able to do abundantly beyond all that we ask. Not yet done yet. He's able to do far more abundantly above all that you ask and think. Does that include just about everything? This is saying that God can do infinitely more than we can imagine. So don't put God in a box. Don't say, well, that's impossible. Because there was a 100-year-old woman who had been barren all her life who gave birth to a son. Because God does impossible things. Is there a situation where you have said, it can't be done, it can't be changed? Don't believe it. That's living by sight. Live by faith. Now again, will God do that impossible thing? You don't know. But don't deal with him on any other terms than you can do anything. Don't say, well, I know you can't do this. Don't say that. Look at this verse. Beyond anything what you can ask or think. Beyond what you can think? If you're going to live by faith, you have to believe the impossible is possible. Are you doing that? Are you living that way? Don't live by sight. A fourth lesson we learn is found in verses 17 and 19. By verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, in Isaac your descendants shall be called. And he, Abraham, considered that God is able to raise people from the dead, raise people even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. When God promised Abraham that he was going to have descendants, that numbered as the stars of the sky and the sand of the seashore, they were too old to have children, but they believed, and they did have a child. And Isaac was born, and everyone laughed with joy. How long between God's promise was the child born? How long a period it was? Do you know what that was? A year, maybe? God promised in a year? No. 2 years? 5 years? No. 10 years. He turns to his wife and he says, wasn't it 10 years ago God promised that we would have a son? She'd say, yeah, it was 10 years ago. And 15? Nothing. 20? Remember 20 years ago God told us that we'd have a son? Yeah. We still don't have a son. 25 years. And they've become pregnant and have a child. 25 years of waiting. That was all in God's plan. And now the son has grown to a young man, and he's the one, like the sand of the seashore, is going to come forth out of this one child. Great nation. And God comes to him another day, and he says, you know that son who you love, who I promised you, who you waited 25 years for? I want you to kill him. And he didn't explain anything. And he said, go to a mountain range that's 3 days away, and I want you to kill him on the top of that mountain. And for 3 days and 3 nights, Abraham had to walk knowing that this was what he was supposed to do. Are you really going to do this? And how is God who you think he is? He said, it's through Isaac that your descendants will come. Now I want you to kill Isaac. And what did Abraham do with that? He didn't just throw up his hands and turn his back on God. He said, even though it makes no sense, even though I don't understand, I'm going to believe him anyway. I'm going to believe that he raises the dead. I guess that's the only way it can make sense. He's going to be the one. I got to kill him. He's got to bring him back to life. And that's what he believed. even though he didn't understand it. That's what he told himself. The fourth mark of living by faith, here it is, obeying God without having to understand. Obeying God without having to understand. That's exactly what was going on in his case. In your case, it might be, God, why do I have to forgive her for what she did for me? She's been so cruel to me. God, look, no one is driving the speed limit. Why should I drive the speed limit? God, my boss is telling me I have to lie for him, and if I don't, I'll lose my job. What does God say? God gives clear commands about what we're supposed to do, and that we're supposed to obey them, whether or not we understand or agree with them. God says, you forgive those who hurt you. You obey the laws of the land. You don't lie. And doing those things might make your life harder or worse. But that's not the point. The point is, like Abraham, God's given you a clear command. What are you going to do? And if you don't understand, that doesn't mean you just walk away from it. God says, I want you to obey anyway. There's an old saying, and you may have heard this, God said it, I believe it, and that settles it. That's a good saying. It can be shortened, though. It can be shortened to, God said it, and that settles it. Because it doesn't matter if I believe it or understand it, right? If God said it, that settles it. If I agree, it's true, and if I disagree, it's still true. And in this life, there are many things that God's going to say, and you're going to say, I don't understand that. But it's so clear, what are you going to do? And if you live by sight, you're going to say, well, it doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand it. No, I'm not going to obey God. And Abraham could have done that. I'm not killing my only son that I waited 25 years for. How many of us would do that? But he knew the clear command of God. And he said, I don't understand it, but I'm going to obey it anyway. God left Abraham no doubt about what he wanted. And Abraham all but killed his son. I mean, inches away from killing his son. He didn't choose to walk by sight. He chose to walk by faith. And that is some faith. Do you have that faith today? Faith to obey God even though you don't understand what he can possibly be doing by giving this command? I don't understand it. I don't agree with it. Will you obey God anyway? He waits to see if you will. God's watching. God was watching Abraham. And he said, now I know that this man truly loves me. And God is doing the same with us every single day. He gives us all sorts of commands in the Bible. Are you going to obey? He watches. Living by faith means you obey, even if you don't understand. You just obey him. If that situation lies in front of you, give God your faith today and obey him. Make the commitment. Even though I don't get it, I'm going to do it because it's very clear what you've told me to do. That's living by faith. So here we have the 4 marks of Abraham's life. 4 marks of a person who's living by faith. And the question is, are you seeing those marks in your life? Is there 1 or 2 of those marks that you don't see in your life? Then God would have you to change that today. You want to change that today. Number 1, first mark, a willingness to follow God out of your comfort zone, even if it's scary. Are you willing to do that? You cannot run in fear from what God is opening for you to do and be a person who lives by faith. You got to kill fear and be okay with living out of your comfort zone. Number 2, you need to be willing to wait for God to work instead of demanding results right now. Do you need to wait? Tell God you're willing to wait for his perfect timing. He knows what he's doing. You need to trust him that he knows what he's doing. Number 3, are you willing to believe the impossible instead of putting God in limits in a box? He can only do this much. Beyond all that you can ask or think is what God is capable of. Deal with him that way. Deal with him according to that truth. And number 3, to obey without having to understand instead of only doing what makes sense. These are 4 marks of Abraham's life of a man who lived by faith. Do you need to change anything? Any of these not what you are, and you can just say, I need to do better in that. Then make the change today. Tell God you'll make the change today. Be one of the few people on earth who are known to be a person of great faith, who will take God at his word, and even though everything looks a certain way, you're going to believe what God says, to see the unseen things of God.